Hello world, I'm Max. Welcome to another episode of State Copy Podcast. As always, I'll remind you to review episode 0 and its appended segments for terms, conditions, and disclosures applicable to the entirety of this content. Thank you. Good morning. Today I'd like to talk about intellectual decadence. It's a cool notion I just came across. While I was doing sort of my morning ritual, I watched a talk that Malcolm Gladwell did on some YouTube channel called Brain Bar. It was titled, What World Awaits Gen Z? And it was on weak link versus strong link systems. And he did a really cool comparison of football, soccer, and basketball, and he framed it as the way you build a really strong soccer team is you focus on improving the weak link, and on a basketball team you focus on improving the strong link. So there's different kind of systems that favor different strategies for optimal function. And I thought this was a real... I basically got through the lecture component, and then at the Q&A, they got to this idea of where they described intellectual decadence. And I thought it connected very nicely with what I wanted to talk about today. As I went to sleep last night, I wanted to think about, in my theory of everything and what this is for, and what I am and how all this works, that I'm trying to observe and describe. I thought it was appropriate to have a conversation about morals, ethics, and I go back to the conversation, this notion of veganism frequently, because I was married to one for 14 years, and I've got a lot of conversation. I have a lot of experience in the trenches of arguing the cases for and against, and listening to people argue the cases for and against a vegan diet. And I think it really everything kind of fits together really nicely. And I'm thinking I might do eventually an SCP Cheers episode on this topic of intellectual decadence and the second and third order consequences that must be considered when you indulge in intellectual decadence, especially if you want to have a conversation about morals and ethics. So, let's dive right in. There's this state we reach where, and Malcolm Gladwell described it as this place where, like centers for higher learning, like the Harvards of the world, they create these, we have this tendency to over-optimize for the strong link system of like higher education. And we create these little walled gardens for thinking, and we remove the adversity of just daily survival that most of the planet is subjected to from these folks that participate in these systems, and we give them the opportunity to explore their intellectual curiosity completely unencumbered by that adversity. And what happens is eventually this kind of rot sets in where that intellectual curiosity starts overindulging in intellectual decadence. It loses connection to the shared state of everything outside of the walled garden that it exists in. And it spends a lot of time on this decadent thought where, and this is where I think wokeism, veganism, a lot of these things come from. And that might be a controversial statement. Somebody might hear me say that and say, what a bastard. How dare he? Somebody who's very dialed into they're oversubscribed, I'd say, to this particularly harmful overindulgence. So let's take I don't know where to start with this because it's such a big idea. I want to, because I've already spent some effort thinking about morals and ethics around diet and how people, because I mentioned I've had experience with this conversation, and I find myself, because I grew up on a small farm. My dad was a rancher and farmer, and we literally, I was a 4-H kid, and we showed cattle, and my cow was a Holstein heifer, Holstein Springer. And the way the business of our little farm worked, that was kind of a microcosm of the one that my dad grew up in, was we sought the tax advantages of having a productive farm. So there were some requirements around that business that that my dad invested a lot of time in making sure that we met. And it didn't necessarily equate to, it wasn't we didn't make a lot of money doing it. My parents both worked. My father was a truck driver, and my mother, his second wife, my stepmother, worked at a university, writing grants and stuff like that, and doing a lot of the logistics around funding a nursing department. And then my dad's first wife, my mom one, I think of them like mom one and mom two. And mom one was, she did substitute teaching in grade schools, and she did just a lot of odd, random jobs. And so they all, specifically the household I spent most of my time in growing up, derived some income from farm activity, and it was a huge part of my childhood. But it didn't really make any money. It was just it was a lifestyle that my dad needed and he thought was important to give to his kids. And so I was a 4-H kid, and my cow Oreo that I had to work with. When you're in 4-H, for the urbanites out there that have no exposure to this lifestyle, it's kind of like a club, an after-school club where you kind of teach kids. You try and get kids enthusiastic about farming, the farm life, and we'd work with our cows and we'd show them at the county fair once a year. I think we did it for 2 years, and it's kind of silly. I mean, you groom your cow and try and make it's a cow. And you get it to march around in a circle and stand just a certain way for the judges to decide who has the best cow for looks and behavior. Well, I describe all that because it means I had an intimate connection with a target for factory farming. Oreo, in order to teach Oreo to walk around in circles and stand just such a way to be judged at some event where there's a whole bunch of people, it took a lot of practice. Like I had to spend a lot of time as a kid getting to know the personality of this creature, and I built an affection. Like she was kind of like a pet, you know. It was, and cows are a lot smarter and a lot nicer than people give them credit for. They're kind of really fun animals. And Oreo, now the business model for our little farm was that Oreo had to be, all of these Holstein Springers, what we would do is we would buy them as calves and raise them up to where they could be artificially inseminated, and then once they had a calf in them, then we'd take them to the stock markets, livestock market, livestock auction, that's what I'm trying to say, and they'd be sold. But it was critical that they had to be, like 6 months along in their pregnancy, because they weren't going to be a productive, and these were Holsteins, they were supposed to go to dairies for milk production. But if a cow cannot get pregnant, then it's just slaughtered. It goes off to slaughter. And when so Oreo, my cow, for whatever reason, was not able to. We tried several times, and there's a cost to bring a vet out to do an artificial insemination, and it just never worked with my cow. And my sister's cow got knocked up pretty easy, and hers was Dolly, I think, or no, Frankie. So all of the cows but my cow that I spent a lot of time getting to know and teach stuff to were able to get pregnant, and they were sold off and everything was fine. Well, mine wasn't able to get pregnant, and the simple economics of the small farm we were on is, well, then Oreo had to be sold for beef. And I was there. I went to the auction and I watched Oreo get auctioned off for beef. And I actually had a dream a few nights later that I was at a McDonald's, and I opened up, and I remember describing this years later. I don't really remember the dream, but I remember opening the top of my quarter pounder with cheese at McDonald's, taking the top bun off and looking down at the beef patty, and the words Oreo, the letters OREO, were written into the beef patty in like fat. And it spooked me and it woke me up. So it means, and at the time I was probably like 12 or 13 years old. And I had actually witnessed, at a neighbor's farm, I watched a cow be slaughtered because for whatever reason it couldn't make it to auction. And so I think my dad just kind of knew that would be a brutal thing for his children to witness, but it was something he grew up with, and I think it informed it provided some valuable insight into what all this was. And I watched not Oreo but another cow, the butcher come out. He had a .22 Magnum and went out into the field. The cow looked at him and he pointed the .22 Magnum at the cow's head, Shot it once, kind of in the head, and it just collapsed. Sort of died immediately, I think. And then I watched him. If you've never seen a cow slaughtered, it's a pretty gruesome process. At one point, with no head and no skin, the nerves, there's a effect that the body does where the central nervous system, and I watched this headless cow with no skin at one point try to stand up while it was being chopped to bits. And so I share all this to give some like deep insight into like the progression of my thought around like factory farming, and because I love steak. I eat one of the best meals I can prepare is a ribeye, and I can grill it to perfection. I've studied it. And now I want to go back to that dream and when I woke up and the fact that I had to come to terms with the fact a friend of mine, a pet, was taken to the slaughterhouse at a young age. And I never felt particularly traumatized by any of this information. I just think, I hear, but I've had conversations with people that are deeply committed to their vegan beliefs. My first wife, most recently it was this guy I worked with who I could tell was just so very intelligent dude that I could tell was just overwhelmed, or not overwhelmed, he was all consumed. Like most of his free thought was being occupied with what he felt was an extreme injustice about factory farming and the lack of ethical treatment of other animals in our ecosystem. And you know, we kind of went back and forth one day while I was on a trip out where he lived. He lived on the other side of the country. And we went out for drinks one night, me, him, and a DevOps guy on our team. And the three of us sat and talked. And he really wanted to do his best to convince me that he was right. And, you know, I love any kind of debate and conversation, and I like the way it pushes. And the conversation definitely, I mean, it stuck with me afterwards, because I like to explore rich ideas like that and then pick them apart later. And so it was the conversation stuck with me, and I think it's really apropos to this talk. He never grew up I think he grew up in a more suburban lifestyle, and I can't remember for sure. But I don't think he could relate to certainly any of my farm stories or my 4-H stories. And he could tell I was a deep thinker, a moral person. That's not fair to say. I don't know if he could tell I was I think he thought I was pretty amoral for being willing to eat cows and pigs. But I think he realized that I was eager for the discussion. Let's say that. And so I think that's all important setup for now shifting to the Lion King. As I think about these things now, I think so let's look at the Disney movie many of us grew up with, The Lion King. and the circle of life. And let's look at some of the characters. Timon and Pumbaa and Simba and Scar. So if you've never seen this movie, I apologize, but I have a kid and I grew up with a little sister, so I watched a lot of Lion King, even though it was a little bit after my time. You have this lion whose father is, I don't want to get into the whole story of the Lion King. You have this young lion who is casted out unjustly, and he feels deeply guilty because he was wrongly convinced that he was responsible for his father's death. And so he kind of rejects the life that he grew up with, and he goes off into the jungle, and he comes across Timon and Pumbaa. And for the life of me, I can't remember what, one's a warthog, and the other one is a lemur or something like that. So they come across Simba sort of starving in the desert, and when they realize he's a lion, they kind of shit themselves. And then one of them comes up with the idea, hey, we should make this guy our friend. Would be kind of cool to have a lion in our corner. And so they buddy up with Simba, the young, baby lion, who's kind of like a young kid. And it sounds like they've got the kid voicing him is probably in his, 10, 11, 12, something like that. And this lion decides to be their friend, Timon and Pumbaa's friend. And Timon and Pumbaa teach him to eat like they do, and to eat grubs. And they say something like slimy but satisfying or something like that. And they teach, and supposedly this lion, Simba, this young lion is supposed to grow up into adulthood, eating just grubs and stuff, and being good buddies with some stuff that would be a pretty yummy snack for him. That's a fun idea, and it's cool for telling that story, but the reality is Simba would have very quickly figured out that he needed to eat those two, and he would have eaten them, and then he would have gone somewhere else because the grubs wouldn't have sustained him. His digestive system, well, a bunch of birds showed up. They're making so much noise I can't talk. I'm going to go in. Time out. Where was I? Timon and Pumbaa and Simba living in the jungle eating bugs. I was getting right to the part where Simba ate his two buddies, Timon and Pumbaa, and because in the real world outside of the Disney movie, lion couldn't sustain itself on just there wouldn't be enough bugs and grubs for it to sustain itself. So it would have just probably Simba would have gobbled his two buddies up. But let's just pretend for a second he didn't. At the point in the movie where he fights his uncle, who actually killed his father, Scar, his old uncle, who's not nearly as strong as his father, would have whooped his ass if he grew up on grubs and somehow managed to live the way Disney portrays it. The fact is, its evolution is a system that is pretty ruthless. This universe we live in, actually, for a lot of really good reasons, I think, has a lot of darkness. The agitation that all of us participants are subject to is what makes this interesting. And without it, we'd just be we'd be jello. We'd be a soup of very uninteresting things. It's all of the adversity that we're subject to that we have to overcome, and then we compete against each other. And that's why we have the circle of life. And we have, in The Lion King, and that's why I use it as an analogy here, is it's really fucking brutal. Like if you watch a bear eat something in the wild, there is nothing humane about nature. It's a brutal fucking place. And just watch how it works. And so then that begs a question for the intellectually decadent who want to sit around and spend a lot of time. They might judge, like that movie, it'd have a lot different tone if Simba just ate his buddies, or if he somehow managed to keep himself alive on bugs long enough to get to the scene where he faces his uncle. Scar would have just cut him to pieces, because he wouldn't be strong enough to fight him. He wouldn't have any skills. He wouldn't know anything he needed to Scar definitely would have whipped his ass, and then would have, I guess the word, it would have been continued suffering at Scar and the hyenas for all the rest of the wildlife in the jungle. And so, I mean, that's just kind of a silly way to point out some really important truths. And it means, if you look at factory farming and all of its horrid principles, characteristics, behaviors, what do I want to say? I actually agree with being somebody who grew up and experienced that whole thing I described with Oreo, the cow. I have a lot of empathy, and I think I actually value the cognitive ability. I really think of a lot of these things like family these days in how I think. And I think when we develop Neuralink, it's not going to be too long until we're able to plug Neuralink into whales and dolphins and cows and dogs. And we're going to find out there's a lot more to them than we realized. But I still won't allow myself the intellectual decadence, any embrace of the fact that I won't waste any of my internal compute on questions of morals and ethics around these subjects, because I realize that it's largely wasted. We summarily dismiss the cognitive ability of things like cells and bacteria, viruses. The fact is, we have no idea. We don't understand them. We can't talk to them. We don't know. We look at them with our electron microscopes and all of these wondrous tools we've created, and we study them, and we see a lot more complexity than our cavemen origins were able to contemplate. But we still don't have a fucking clue how most of it works. We don't know how these cells can orchestrate construction of a human so well. How do they know where to grow a finger and where to grow a liver? We're learning this. It's all unfolding. But we make a lot of assumptions about all of these critters in the universe around us. And you don't realize how much bacteria you have in your body that's keeping you alive. We're very much, we have these things that are not parasites, but we live in symbiosis with them. And without them, like if you look at our gut biome, there are, and I actually looked this up before I started doing this recording, and I found this somebody trying to describe how many bacteria die in us every day, and they're using exponentials to describe it, and so this universe is filled with a lot of sort of destruction. Like there's a lot of things are trying stuff in a violent way. They're bouncing off of each other and sustaining each other, and wasting any emotion or thought on the good or bad of it is it's all wasted compute. It's a overindulgence of intellectual decadence. You don't realize that you just living one more day is going to murder a number you can hardly imagine in bacteria. You personally are responsible for that death. Now, why is that bacteria that's, from an evolutionary standpoint, wildly complex? When we look at some of these things, they're older and more interesting than we are in some ways. Why is it? Why spending a bunch of time trying to draw these distinctions? And this happens a lot in like the abortion versus pro-choice. A lot of these things feel like us spending a lot of time trying to draw a line in the sand between ethical and unethical behavior, and trying to spend a lot of time, and we're not, here's a horrible, what do I want to say, a sad reality of human cognitive ability is that we can do these wondrous things, but we can also do very foolish things that have second and third order consequences that totally subvert the ambition of the original thing. So I see this in climate change, climate debate, and climate policy, the way we've completely ignored oil and gas, and now we've put ourselves in this place of scarcity that means, in a real way, folks like Greta Thunberg are directly responsible for a lot of hardship that's about to happen, potentially. Like, I'm hoping that we just we come to our senses and we will all work together to minimize that. But because of the scarcity of resources that's been inflicted on trying to solve climate change realities, the realities of climate change in a clunky way where it's like humans have Greta has the best intentions, but she has no understanding of most of the underlying mechanics of how the system she lives in works. And she doesn't realize that through her inspiring Germany to virtue signal to the rest of the world, and set the standard for how everyone should act in, and how we should generate energy necessary for our continued progress and healthy function. The second and third order consequences are now we find ourselves in an energy crisis where a lot of people could potentially suffer if we don't have some really, a series of really tame winters in Europe. Ironically, we might get that because of climate change. There could be a real crisis. A bunch of people could die in the wrong places, places that don't have a lot of money and don't have access to, and that might be an exaggeration, because it could be that Europe is rich enough to go beg, borrow, and steal what it needs to keep all of its populace well-fed and housed through a collection of harsh winters, or even one ill-timed one. But the second and third order consequence of that is they're going to take it from some place that doesn't have those resources, or they're going to buy it, and then somebody who doesn't have the resources to pay very much, they're going to bid up the price, and it means a bunch of people that aren't able to pay the price are going to suffer, maybe outside of Europe. And humans are so bad. We think we're so much smarter than we are. And then we start doing all these incredibly impactful changes. Like, we do things like we say, there's this story of like in Hawaii, the rats got out of control, I think, and so they brought mongoose, because the mongoose would eat the rats, and they bring an invasive species in on accident, just because through our bumbling, and it totally starts effing with the whole ecosystem in a really isolated ecosystem, and then we foolishly think, well, we can just solve it with this, and then it turns out the mongoose eat the rats, but then they also eat all the birds, and so now there's no there's no birds of parrot, there's no parrots, and the beautiful birds that you find in other islands around the world, they're all completely gone because the mongoose just went and ate up all the eggs and murdered them all off. We do this all over the fucking place. I mean, we're a brash, overconfident, sometimes, and we justify our actions sometimes in some of the in healthy ways that would seem on the surface to be admirable, and we don't realize that we're causing all of these other massively radical dysfunction later. And so when I look at vegans, I see people that are so comfortable and so insulated from the realities of this universe. They've been so shielded from the adversity that surrounds us everywhere because of our progress. They've invented things to worry about. And they've invented something to be, and I love the passion of it. I love any expression of people pursuing something they really care about. But I'm not judging them. I kind of am, except like all of these forces are really necessary. They're all actually part of the process. So I don't say this from a place of judgment. I'm more just trying to offer up a new perspective that I think would be healthy. And I would suggest that folks like Greta Thunberg and my friend the vegan would spend a lot more time on second and third order consequence thought. Like, spend a bunch more time understanding, for Greta, how energy production in the world works, and the second and third order consequences of suddenly restricting supply, and what that means, like how many children are going to die because they don't have heating energy at a certain moment, or because there's no fertilizer or water in a place, so somebody has to starve. Those things really can happen. And how do you weigh, my pushback to these folks is, how do you balance the ethics of that? How do you condemn some poor child in Kazakhstan or in another nation that doesn't have a rich, productive export economy and plenty of wealth to go buy up resources it needs when it's starved for them. It's really useful to think this way because we can maybe avoid a lot of those second and third order consequences, and we don't have to fight with each other so much. A lot of these debates, like the ones around policy, climate policy, the morals of right to life, right to choice, vegan versus carnivore diet, all of these things cause us to draw little lines in the sand between each other and judge each other in a really unproductive way. I think all of these things that die seemingly needlessly, that right now, as I speak, some poor animal is getting torn apart really painfully in a way that's way less humane than that the guy that came out to my neighbor's farm and slaughtered that animal. No, they're gonna, with large teeth, bite into a creature that can feel it, and the agony that they will suffer is really awful to consider. But then they'll die, and the way I understand all of this and what it is I think they will basically get collected into a big unified, I think when we move from that binary state of alive versus dead, I think our cognitive, our individual cognitive state is just sort of merged with a collection of all the things that died, all the things that were an example of what not to do to win in the evolutionary game of all this agitation. And I think that's when people take back feelings from the afterlife, or I think certain psychedelics unlock sort of a path to just sort of temporary connection to that. I think that's what they're tapping into. They're tapping into this great big collection of things that didn't work that are becoming really interesting and wise through that knowledge and merging with all the other things that didn't work. That's I find that to be a beautiful construction of how this works. And it seems logical to me because I would build a system to do that. There'd be so much value in taking all the things that didn't work and merging them in that way. So when I realized that whatever constructed me is something that's, and all of this I see around me, this entire system, they would have already come to that. That is, it's obviously an advantage to retain that data and treat it that way. So, it puts me very at peace with the fact I like ribeyes. It puts me, because I don't feel it's a valuable expenditure of my internal compute to waste a lot of time judging myself or others around me for making the decision to eat a cow instead of a tree. That just sounds like intellectual decadence to me, and entirely a waste of how I use my mind. So, and I'd also argue that the quickest way to mitigate all the casualties in this thing is to quickly become smart enough to realize that this is fundamentally how the universe works. It's all about state optimization of self and the collective. And until we figure out a way to pull all of those useless arguments out and refrain from all the unforced errors that we constantly inflict upon ourselves, we will, until we can optimize our collective state, will be an insane thing. And a lot more things will have to die. A lot more bacteria in all of our guts. A lot more animals out in the wild. A lot more, all of it will suffer the inhumane end that the Greta Thunbergs and the vegans are so upset about. They're just prolonging it by all of us. Now, all of us participate in this arguing with each other over bullshit. And we need to just, what evolution looks like for us, an evolution of our collective consciousness, is each of us optimizing our internal state so that we can see this very clear, observable truth of this universe and what we are. And to begin collaborating in ultra efficient ways like the cells in our bodies do, where we don't fight over bullshit, you know? And so I think that's going to be the end of this one. I think I'm going to go walk now, and I think I'm going to just listen to episode 49 and 50 so that I can get those released. To anybody listening, you are the coolest, and we can do this. We will find sanity. I know it.